What's up everyone, we're back at it again. My name is Brad and welcome back to my channel. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the secrets into knowing whether or not you're under or over watering your plants. Get this secret right and your plants will thrive. Get it wrong and your plants won't. I know you're sitting on the edge of your seat, so let's get into the secret. The headache of trying to figure out whether or not you're under versus overwatering your plants primarily comes down to the fact that these symptoms can look very similar to each case. Underwatering can look very similar to overwatering, and overwatering can look very similar to underwatering. Although they look very similar to one another, if you look closely at what your plants are doing, and if you understand what your plants are doing, it becomes a lot easier to unlocking the secrets of whether or not you're under or overwatering your plant. In either case, after this video is over, you will be able to make the necessary adjustments that you need in order to make sure that your plant continues to live its best life. So let's start off with the underwatering scenario. Regardless of if you are under or overwatering your plant, you have to remember that everything is starting at the root system. The root system is the system that is responsible for taking that moisture from the soil and distributing it across your plant. So in the case of underwatering, what exactly is happening? In the case of underwatering, what basically is happening is your roots have no moisture to wick up from the soil. And if your roots have no moisture to wick up from the soil, then your leaves will suffer. The water essentially travels, or think of it as the water traveling from the soil to the root system, up through the crown of the plant, and up the length of the plant. So starting at the bottom, closest to the soil, all the way up to the furthest leaf. In the case of underwatering, you will notice signs closest to the crown before you do furthest away. So what that means is if you have wilting, for instance, and the wilting is occurring closest to the soil first, that is a sign that you are getting to the very beginning stages of underwatering your plant. If you notice that the bottom leaves have begun to yellow, that too is a sign that you are at the beginning stages of underwatering your plant. If you also notice that the leaves that are closest to the soil are beginning to brown out and dry out, while the leaves that are further away from the soil are starting to wilt, well, you are in the later stages of underwatering, but it can be reversed. By reverse, I don't mean magically allowing the yellowing leaves to become green, but what I do mean is you can save the plant in order to hopefully allow it to begin to bounce back. So in the case of this philodendron, heartleaf philodendron, if I have underwatered a plant, I will notice a lot of yellowing at the crown or closer to the crown of the plant as opposed to further away in the vines. And in the case of underwatering, what I would do is I would want to make sure that I super saturate the soil. This is important when you have underwatered your plant. And the reason why it is important is because when you underwater your plant, typically what happens is your soil becomes hydrophobic. And by hydrophobic, what that means is you try to water from the top, and when you water from the top, your soil really isn't getting saturated. It's not getting wet. And if the soil isn't getting wet, then again, your roots have nothing to uptake, and you run into this problem of your plant still being underwater despite the fact that you are watering. So the trick around this is to really try to bottom water your plant. You can, for instance, stick a wick in the bottom of your plant, place the plant in a saucer, and begin to water. You can also put your pot in some kind of container. And when you put that pot in a container, what will happen is that soil will slowly start to draw in that moisture. And as it's drawing in that moisture, it then becomes less and less hydrophobic. And before you know it, that root ball will become saturated again and it will not be hydrophobic. But that's another topic. I will let you know though that when you are trying to figure out whether or not you have a hydrophobic root ball, a lot of times what you'll see the edges of your root ball kind of come in from your pot. So you'll have a space in between where your root ball is and where the edge of your pot is. But keep that in mind. If you're underwatering, chances are you do have a hydrophobic root ball, and you want to make sure that you reverse that hydrophobic root ball by getting it saturated again, and then begin to water your plant as normal. If you like videos like this and want to continue to see more videos about houseplant tips and tricks, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. It's totally free. It would mean a lot. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to talking about under versus overwatering. So we talked about underwatering and what those symptoms look like, as well as how to go about trying to reverse when you have a plant that's underwatered. But what happens when you have the opposite of that? What happens when your plant is overwatered? Well, again, we have to go back into looking at our root system and knowing what the plant is trying to do. In the case of overwatering, you have to remember that your plant or your root system is constantly trying to wick moisture from the soil. If your soil or your root ball is wet for an extended period of time, your plant will start to exhibit symptoms of being overwatered at the furthest edge of either your stem, trunk, vine, before the crown of the plant. So what these symptoms will look like, for instance, is if you have wilting of the leaves. Wilting of the leaves that are furthest away from your vine or tree first, and then working their way slowly towards the crown, is a sign that your plant is trying to increase the surface area of the leaf. By increasing the surface area of the leaf, it allows for more transpiration through that leaf, and as your leaves are transpiring that extra moisture, it's just your way of your plant trying to get rid of moisture that it doesn't need. So that's why you'll notice that wilting. But again, you would have to really look at your plant fairly regularly to see that your plant is wilting from the furthest tip first to the crown last. Secondly, what you can look for is, again, yellowing leaves. Now, the opposite of the underwater scenario where you have the yellowing and browning of the leaves that are very crispy, in the case of overwatering your plant, what will actually happen is your leaves will become more mushy. They won't be this very crisp leaf. Instead, they'll be this soggy leaf. And the reason why that's occurring is because the cell walls of your leaf are actually being filled with so much water that they're bursting. And when they burst, your leaves essentially lose the structure or that rigidity that it has thanks to those cell walls. And when they lose that rigidity, that's how you get a very floppy leaf. So be on the lookout for that. Now, when you're overwatering, what I would recommend that you do is I would recommend that you lift the root ball out of your pot, if you can, and just let it dry out. Give it a couple of days, let it air dry. And after you've done that and your root ball has become a little bit more dry, you can place your root ball back into its spot and still hold off on watering. This will ensure or help to make sure that your root ball dries out a little bit more thoroughly before its next watering. I would continue to wait until your root ball has an opportunity to dry out a bit further before continuing to water again. So we've talked about overwatering, but how do you make sure that this doesn't happen in the future? The easiest thing that you can do is you can use a moisture meter. Moisture meters are amazing in that it allows you to get deep into the soil and it allows you to read the moisture level of the soil. Each moisture reader has different ranges. There are some digital moisture meters that range from 0 to 12, and depending on what the meter is reading, it will let you know whether or not your soil is dry, wet, or super saturated. You also have moisture meters that are analog, and it just simply has an arrow, if you will, that tells you whether or not you are wet, okay, dry. But these are very important tools in order to make sure that your plant is really getting the appropriate moisture that it needs. If you don't want to spend the money to get a moisture meter, what you can instead do is you can also just use your finger. Just simply stick your finger into your pot and really figure out whether or not your soil is wet, dry, somewhere in between. You really want to keep it in the somewhere in between. You don't want to keep it too wet. You also don't want to keep it too dry, because in either case, your plant is going to become stressed out by that. So finger or a moisture meter, you really can't go wrong with either one. A moisture meter will give you a more accurate reading of what your plant is doing at any given point in time. So now you have the tools that you need to figure out whether or not you're under versus overwatering your plant. That's the secret. If you have any other questions, please be sure to leave them in the comment section and I'll do my best to get you an answer as soon as possible. My name is Brad. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or if you found this video helpful, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.